I still vividly remember the first games I played on my father's Windows 95 PC. Age of Empires, Tomb Raider, Half-Life. That was back in 1998. I watched some gameplay footage on YouTube, pure out of nostalgia in preparation for this podcast, and man, we have come a long way in the last 20 years. At the exact same time though, in 1998, 5,000 kilometers away from Belgium, where I grew up, our guest on the podcast today, Lalit Vase, was starting what would become an extremely fruitful and successful career in the video games industry. Lalit started in sales at a video games distribution company based in Dubai called Red. Over the years, he climbed up the ladder and became CEO and member of the board, overseeing the growth of the company from $100,000 to $120 million of revenues per year. Pretty impressive, right? But that is only the tip of the iceberg. Lalit seized opportunities along the way and created a video games event company called Power League Gaming, and most importantly, the leading eSports team in the Middle East, Nasr eSports. This is a story about flair and vision, innovation and foresight, and about working towards building an exciting ecosystem around what is probably one of the most future-proofed industry in our modern age.
Brought to you by Scopernia, this is the Future Club, the podcast that uncovers how leaders future-proof their businesses. Here's your host, Jeremy.
First, thank you very much for taking the time and joining the podcast, Lalit. It's an absolute pleasure having you. Can you just give a brief introduction about yourself for our listeners?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. It's good and it's been fun talking to you and getting prepared for this. So introduction to me. So I'm 45 years old. I've lived in Dubai since 1998. I've lived across the Middle East for most of my life. I worked for basically three companies in my life, or been involved with three companies. One is Red Entertainment Distribution, which was the largest distributor of computer games, so on the disc across the MENA region, and we distributed for Electronic Arts, Activision, Ubisoft, Take-Two. So we were 80% market share. I was one of the founders of Power League Gaming. That is probably the biggest company in terms of strategy and activation for brands in the gaming and esports arena. And now I'm focused, mainly on running Nasser eSports, which is an esports team that probably has the most widely known Middle Eastern players who are performing on the global stage. So that's me.
Which is an awesome CV, awesome experience, and we're gonna get a bit more into detail. But first, let's go back a little. So you were born and you grew up in India for until you were 4 or 5, something like that.
So so I was born in Pune. My family then moved to Goa, which is towards the south of India, where my dad was working with the Taj group of hotels and building a hotel for them there.
All right.
And we were there for about 3-4 years, and then we went to Iraq. My dad worked for a hospital in Basra in Iraq for about 5 or 6 years, then back to India, then to Oman, and we were in Oman for about 8 years until we moved to Dubai in 92.
92. So you studied in Dubai.
Yeah, I studied in India, Iraq, Oman, and Dubai. Yeah.
And you joined, and actually Red was your first job, right? You joined them in 1998. So I'm very curious. We're in the 90s. We need to put ourselves back a bit back in time a bit. Were you always attracted by the video games industry? How did you get there?
Not at all. So when I finished university, so I did a BBA from I think it was called the American Center of Education back then. I did a BBA, and while I was doing my BBA, I worked with my dad, who was actually in the environmental business. So how to save electricity, water, petrol in the 90s, which nobody in the Middle East cared about it. And they were like, why should we save petrol? It's cheaper than water. So yes, anyway, it was interesting. So I worked. So I ran a garage as well. I was a partner in a. I love motorcycles, so I ran a garage. So kind of my education about business came from there. When I finished college, I promised myself that I would not work with my father. I was just applying for jobs. I wasn't really interested in corporate, but I was willing to do corporate to learn. So Emirates, Emirates, Unilever, all of these guys. But back then, they didn't even have management trainee programs for non-Arabs here, right? So it was kind of tough. You had to like go in at the really low level and start learning, right? So I actually saw an ad in the newspaper that said, if you know the difference between Lara Croft and FIFA, contact us. So it was an interesting ad.
Yeah, that's it's
Right?
crazy that you remember it as well.
No, I remember it. So I looked at the ad and I went, well, I know FIFA. I love sports. I of course I know FIFA. Blah blah blah. So I didn't even know it was a video game company. And Lara Croft, I was like, okay, Tomb Raider. So I know one is a movie, one is football. I didn't even know both were video games, right? But I called up for the interview. So I called up, and the person who answered was actually a friend of my girlfriend at the time.
Okay.
So grew up. So he actually recognized the voice and said, hey, is this Lalit? I was like, yeah. He's like, oh, it's Sheldon. I'm like, oh, great. I'm like, what's the company about? And he said, yeah, man, we sell video games. It's a small company, but it's interesting and you should try it. Come and speak to Mike at least. And yeah, so I went for the interview. I remember I was all, tie and stuff and with suit, tie. And I kept fiddling with my tie. And Mike was a lovely guy, amazing experience, right? Started with Pedigree Pet Chum, worked with Brown, Gillette, BAT, like unbelievable corporate experience. And he said to me, hey, if you join me, you'll never have to wear a tie again in your life. I was like,
You were sold.
done. Yeah, that's how I started.
And how small? Because you said it was very small when you joined. How small was
in
it?
the first 18 months of the business, that I was in the business, we did $100,000 in revenue. Right? And when we finished off, it was $120 million in revenue.
That's quite
about 2 years ago. Yeah.
That's crazy. And what was at that time? So at the end of the 90s, what was the stage of the gaming industry? Which games were highly successful back then?
Let's say nothing's changed. So back then, FIFA. Actually, Pro Evolution was more popular than FIFA at the time. So football was popular. Driving games were so Need for Speed,
Yeah, I remember
GT
that.
Racing, they were popular. And shooting games. I don't know if Call of Duty was out, but
Counter-Strike was probably already.
Counter-Strike was, yes, Counter-Strike. So shooting, if you can kick it, shoot it, or or drive it, they loved it in the Middle East, and it hasn't changed much. I mean, those core genres are still very, very popular.
Yeah.
In the Middle East, much more popular on an index, much more popular than they are in other places. But back then, it was actually mainly PC. So when we started off as a PC distributor, we were not doing because this was like PlayStation 2 time.
Yeah.
1998 is PlayStation 2. It was highly pirated. No sales on Play. We would sell 200 units or 300 units of PlayStation original, and the pirated market would be selling 200,000 copies, right?
Okay.
So we were only selling PC because PC you could they had anti-piracy stuff. It was more difficult. If you got a copy, it wouldn't work properly because they had a way of checking whether it's original or not. Yeah. So it grew from there.
And at that time, were there already professional gaming teams or not yet?
Not at all. Professional gaming teams, I guess we were the first in 2016. So about 15, 16, that's
Here in
kind
the
of
region,
when it started. People even started thinking about forming teams.
Yeah.
Maybe a year before there were, let's say, clans. So 8 friends, 20 friends get together, they all play the same game, they call themselves a clan, and that's how they identified themselves.
Yeah.
And that of course came from the West, right? So you had clans in like Warcraft and this and that,
Yeah.
and then from that, even in other games, clans started joining together where they shared, let's say, the love of the game, but also help others improve and stuff when you join the clan, right?
And how do you explain that? Because I mean, esports it hasn't been big for a long time, but it has existed for a while. I mean, when you talk about the US or
absolutely.
even Asia,
More than 20 years.
yeah, more than 20 years. How do you explain that it has come as late here in the Middle East? Because there is potential. There are a lot of people that are playing games.
So I think everything comes late to the Middle East anyway. In terms of trends and catching up with trends, we're probably 5 years behind the UK and probably 8 to 10 years behind the US, right? So if something comes out in the US today that's like cutting edge technology, by the time it gets to us, it's universally adopted here, it's going to be 10 years, and that's just how it works, I think. But esports even more difficult because gaming here culturally was never seen. It's like, oh, kids play it. It was never seen as a good way to spend your time. It has always been, hey, it's a way to keep the kids quiet, and then the kids get hooked, and you're like, oh my god, now the kids are spending so much time. Are they just wasting their time? Is it really helping them? So it was always looked at because. Of course, the Middle East is influenced from two sides, right? From Asia, which is India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. They have a huge influence from there. And the West, much less, I'd say, culturally.
Yeah.
Now, the influence of the West has grown in the last 10 or 15 years, but otherwise, all Asian, their own culture, and then Asian culture is influencing much more. So even me, my kid playing video games, I would never ever dreamt it. I'm like, go and play football or hockey or something on the street. Why are you going to play video games, which is extremely expensive?
Yeah.
Right? So that's why I think it's taken much longer. People play games, but then esports at least took even longer for people to adopt. Until today, I have to have conversations convincing parents to allow their kids to spend the time playing video games because they're so good at it, right?
Yeah. And so you joined in 1998 and you basically climbed up the ladder of Red to the top because you ended up being at the top of the company, sitting on the board, and you still are, right, today. So it's been a while. And then at some point in 2013, if I'm not mistaken, you founded Power League Gaming.
Yes, mid to end of 2013, I think.
How did you come up with the idea? What was your inspiration?
So actually, it wasn't my idea. This guy called John Lacey, who back then actually executed some events for us. So back then we used to do a game show where Sony, Microsoft, Red would all put money in to do a game show once a year to show all the new titles that were coming. And every year we would go to agencies to pitch to run that show for us, right? Because that's not our core business. So John Lacey actually ran it for us, and then he ran a couple of other events. And at that point, I would call it, it was the start of esports, where the business had grown big enough that there was enough money to now spend saying, how do you keep this community engaged? EA, probably of all the publishers, EA has, to me, have always been ahead of everybody else in terms of strategy, right? So they were like, it needs to become like a lifestyle. So this needs to be part of their everyday life. So they're like, hey, all year you've got to keep the community engaged. So we were like, hey, tournaments is like the easiest thing to do. The kids are going to love it. There's not much to do here in the summer. It's all indoors. So, it kind of makes sense. And we didn't think as Red, we wanted to build that as a core competency within Red, right? Because our business was growing at such a pace. It was like, hey, can we afford to spend time now going and trying to build this? So John Lacey actually came to me and I actually said to him, hey, you've done these events. I think this is the direction to go and this is what's going to grow. I know the publishers are going to spend a ton of money. If it takes off, then brands will start spending money and this can really grow into something. And that's how we kind of started PLG, just doing small events. I think we had a 2-year deal with Red. Red, they would exclusively execute all our tournaments, leagues, blah, 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 for 2 years. And then after that, he had to go and find brands to, within those 2 years, he had to build the industry basically, right? So that's how it started.
And what is the biggest project or event that you did with PLG?
So I'd say two. The biggest one, value-wise and revenue-wise, was I think it's called Road to the Nexus. That was the Riot League of Legends tournament for the whole MENA region. So it was actually 750 teams from the MENA region, split into four areas. So like North Africa, Levant, GCC, and Saudi Arabia. So 750 teams. 2 teams from each region qualify and go to a finals in Saudi Arabia for like a $1 million prize pool for the professionals, and there was like $1 million prize pool for influencers. There was an influencer tournament, so we ran that as well. But yeah, so it was huge. I think a $10 million budget was the entire project. We ran pretty much everything, but we had to outsource for the actual production of the tournament in Saudi. We flew in over 200 people from Europe to work on the project. Right?
When was that?
Early December, 7th, 8th, 9th December 2019.
Okay, so quite recently.
And then we did 2018 December, we did what we call PLG Grand Slam. So actually a lot of the events we do for different brands and stuff, they all end up in something called PLG Grand Slam, which is like the finals for everything. Different game. And we'll have 5 games. So League of Legends, but during the year we could have done League of Legends with HP, League of Legends with KFC, but it will all feed out to the teams qualified to this one main final, right? So along with PLG, we said, hey, with the Grand Slam, we said, let's try and see if we can get international teams to come. If there's a big enough prize, it's like off season for them, they have nothing going on, and let's see how many people watch it. One is, can we actually produce something of that level, and how much will we learn by doing this project? And we seem to have enough money this year kind of from brands and partners, etc., to go for it. So we actually managed to get, I believe it was 6 or 8 of the top 15 teams in the world in CSGO at the time. And then we did qualifiers in 32 countries across the world, online qualifiers to bring another, let's say, so if 8 teams qualified directly, then the balance came through qualification. That was also, and I think on that one we probably got over 20 million viewers globally. So of course we streamed it in China to a Chinese company, to Russia to a Russian company. It was just for us to actually learn how this whole network works. So those were probably the 2 biggest projects we did.
Really cool. And so if we take a look at your journey, basically you started by distributing video games as a sales manager, I think. Then you climbed up the ladder, and then at some point you realized, okay, there is an opportunity, let's go into events. And that led at some point in 2016 to the creation of Nasr eSports. And again, how did you, because there were already other esports team, but Nasr was actually the first one here in the Middle East, right?
Yes. There was tons of esports teams globally. So in 2014, I gave up my day-to-day operational role at Red.
Okay.
So I actually had 2 partners. I basically sold my shares back to them and sat on the board, and I said, hey, I will still advise you on how to run the company and help build somebody to run the company. But I want some time off. It had been a very fast-paced, exhausting 17, 18
years.
And I knew that Red selling physical games was not going to last for much longer. So my point was, okay, we've got PLG, but again, it's dangerous because publishers own the rights to the IP. So really, if publishers decide to do it themselves, there's almost no work for PLG if the publishers come and invest the money and do everything. So that's risky. Mobile gaming is growing, eSports is growing. I wanted to spend some time going out and researching, looking around, what are people doing across the world, to decide what is the next thing I wanted to to do. I was 39, and I was like, hey, I have to find another gig because Red is not going to go forever. So
And you need to work for 20 more years.
I need to work for 20 more years. So I took that break, and during that break, I spent a lot of time on cloud gaming, mobile gaming, and eSports. Kind of investing in a lot of small companies, getting into the networks, going to the trade shows, kind of building a network of people who were doing cutting edge stuff and all of this. PLG gave me the edge over everybody to go into esports because we were already running tournaments. I knew all the top players, so I came and I basically sat with John and I said, hey man, who are your best players, and really are they world class or not, and can they ever become world class? So then we started like watching the players, who was consistently winning. We ran the Phantom Masters program for I think 3 or 4 years that we built up, which was like again 16 countries in the Middle East, national championships. You get one guy who becomes the Phantom Master, and out of that program somebody won the global championship in 2015. So I think his name is Mr. Dunn Al-Shari from Saudi Arabia. So he won Phantom Masters. He was one of our champions, and he became the world champion. So I was like, oh, holy crap. So and he's there. We know that if somebody without any coaching, like the big teams in the world have coaching and this and that, and some guy from here can just go and win the whole thing, there's obviously talent here, right?
Yeah,
so I was like, hey man, we've got to find out. I want to take the best players. PLG can't be involved in it because PLG runs the leagues, tournaments, You can't run the tournament and own a team. So
conflict of interest.
I'm going to start this 100% on the side. But of course, I have to fund it as well by myself. So we started looking, we looked around. FIFA, we obviously had really good players in FIFA. So actually, Nasr had a lot of FIFA players. But we found one guy was really from Bahrain, Saeed Hashim, who was really good at Mortal Kombat and just so much better than everybody else. And John said to me, he said, hey, if we took a chance, we got to take it on this guy. So we kind of spoke to Warner Brothers, organized a Mortal Kombat tournament because we were distributing for Warner Brothers as well.
Yeah.
Organized a Mortal Kombat tournament, and part of that prize was the winner gets to go to EVO in the US, which is like the biggest fighting game tournament in the world, right?
Wow.
This guy won the tournament. We sent him there with his brother, and he came second, right? He came all the way to the final and almost beat the guy who's been the champion for like 3 or 4 years, Sonic Fox, and love him. He's humble, he's hardworking, he's really smart. And so when that happened, I was like, dude, now I'm convinced that there's enough. The talent is there. We have to find them and we have to spend money and develop them. But if you have a guy in Mortal Kombat who can go from 0 to number 2 in the world pretty much, and you have a guy who's won the FIFA World Cup, I'm convinced there's talent, right?
You can start a team.
There's 320 million people. We can start a team. So we signed him first and then started searching for players. But it was very easy to find players because, they all knew us as PLG, right? So they it was like, okay, Lalit has been involved in PLG. He's opening this new company. We trust him. We trust PLG. And so it was not so difficult to get them over, to get them to sign and convince parents to allow their kids to sign. So that's how it started. And there's 3 different businesses and we could have done many things. I think the most growth we are going to get from esports, from the esports team.
All right, very cool. I have a last question about this first part, which was about your journey as an individual. Can you in your career tell me about something that you were always convinced was true until you realized that it is not?
Yeah, I thought a bit about this, and I actually think that people always say people don't change. Right? People can't change. And I, through my career, seen many people change phenomenally. The way they think, the way they behave, the way they view the world. So I think human beings are extremely powerful. Their minds are extremely powerful. If you spend enough time and effort to figure the person out and figure out how you can talk to them and convince them of this is a way to at least explore, people can change phenomenally.
Cool, that's a really good one. This was the first part of our discussions with Lalit Vase. Next week, we will release part 2 of the podcast, in which we will discuss more about Nasr eSports, what it takes to run a team of young gaming athletes, how to change parents' perception about a career in gaming, and the exciting next steps for this fast-growing industry. Don't hesitate to follow us on Spotify, to subscribe on Apple Podcast or your favorite podcast streaming platform to be notified when we make a new upload. This is the Future Club podcast brought to you by Scopernia. Thank you so much for listening.